One of the many choices we have to make when a new topic comes out is the type of affirmative we're going to be running during this topic. Now, that doesn't mean you're only limited to one type of affirmative during the topic, but generally speaking, we have choices to make because each one has their advantages and disadvantages. The types of affirmatives are the policy, the traditional, the soft left aff, and the critique aff. So we're going to go through each of those four and give you pros and cons of each one and why we may want to run them. Okay. So a policy style affirmative is generally one that has big stick impacts. Those are called extinction impacts. They can be from war, they can be from disease, they can be from environmental destruction. The types of impacts that we have are very varied, and it's up to the debater and the topic, honestly, to decide what sort of like extinctions we're going to have. And I say extinctions with an S because they're generally within more than one contention. And it's one of the big advantages as to why big stick affs and policy style affirmatives are so popular in LD, because multiple contentions allow you to, one, outweigh a lot of negative positions, and two, it can allow you to kick a contention that a negative team overcovers and go for the one that is an undercovered contention. And I've seen this a lot happen where a negative team will just like pile on one contention and the AF just goes, okay, concede this defensive argument, we're going to go for this instead. And then the neg has wasted 3 minutes of their time, right? One of the cool things too with this affirmative is it gets to use utilitarian weighing mechanisms. This means that this can be used versus a lot of negative critical positions. But that being said, it also is one of the cons of a policy style affirmative. So the cons is that it links to literally every single negative argument on the topic, unless you make a hyper-specific big stick aff. Generally speaking, whole res affirmatives will link to every single core controversy, which includes multiple counterplans, and very, very unique and specific counterplans, which makes it a little bit more harder being affirmative running a policy style aff, because people are going to break new counterplans and disads versus you that you may not have research on, compared to like say a critical affirmative where it's probably going to be T, framework, and cap. Another thing is topicality. If you are going too specific, topicality becomes a very big burden that you have to beat out in the 1AR, or the 2NR is just a topicality flow, and good luck, right? And another thing that big stick avs and policy avs in general link into every single critique on the topic as well means that it requires a really good understanding of how your affirmative interacts with those, and it generally limits your options to hit critiques, because it's hard to link turn them unless you go for like, unless it has to do with something that the critique is trying to resolve already within your affirmative. It's generally hard. So you're usually left with let the aff outweigh the critique, because if we're all dead, nothing else matters, and sometimes indicts to the ideology of the critique, i.e. say Baudrillard's general like impact turns to why Baudrillard is a bad person to be running within the debate space, etc. So another affirmative, and this one is the most common in the country, is the traditional affirmative. This is one that is very much so about just a framework and then two contentions that are from the topic that does not have a solvency or a plain text of states ought to do something. I like this one a lot because, one, it's the easiest one to run in terms of having to research. And there's a lot of choices for the frameworks that you can use, and a lot of choices for the contentions as long as they meet. This also means that the contentions don't have to be like 5-6 cards deep. They're generally 2 or 3 cards, if it even has to be that long, because you don't have to prove solvency within a traditional aff. You just have to prove that the resolution should be done, or one is a good idea. So it allows you for a lot of creative options. This is where most philosophy affs fall into, and where tricks affs fall into. I generally don't like to talk about tricks affs because it's embedded within like tech versus truth sort of thing, so we'll ignore that for this video. Now, for the cons of the traditional debate, can be countered with something very similar to the affirmative in itself if a negative has a counter framework and then contention level offense with it, plus turns to the contentions of the affirmative, it may be difficult for the 1AR if the turns are very persuasive because of coverage issues. All the critiques also link into most traditional affs, either at the contention level or the framework level. So say we're dealing with the way morality is being done in the status quo, there are general critiques that link into the idea of what morality means under the status quo, and how the affirmative utilizes it can be sort of like wonky with the aff if they don't realize that the link is not to the contentions but to the framework, right? One of the things also is the topicality is done in a weird way when you're doing a traditional aff, because it becomes a definitions debate. But it's generally not a problem when you're a traditional aff. But if you don't know what a definitions debate looks like under topicality, you will go confused and you will randomly lose if you don't have a really good defense of your definitions, right? Another con is because they're traditional affs, they usually are very predictable. There's only so many that you can run within the frameworks that you have, so it's decently easy to frontline versus it. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that, that they're not viable. They're very, very viable, because if they're predictable, you can also predict what you link into and just beat it out. And lastly, it requires a lot of understanding of philosophies that may be associated with your framework and how it is run in the realm, because it's not going to be utilizing something like consequentialism, right? The third option is the KAF, or critical affirmative. I like these because they don't have to be resolutional. They don't have to follow the resolutional. They can, i.e. they can affirm something, but it doesn't have to fiat anything. It also doesn't have to defend the state, because usually the indites associated with a critical affirmative indict the use of state action to think that it would be a good idea to be used in the first place, because it leads to bad things. It also allows you a creative use of how you want to run it, i.e. you can use narratives, you can use poems, you can do a performance, you can sit silently for the entirety of the aff, though I don't generally advise it. And so it allows for creative ability of debaters to be like, okay, what do I want to do for myself, and to utilize it, right? Another thing is you get access to critical turns versus most positions, i.e. if the negative runs a util position versus you, there are generally really good impact turns to it associated with your critical affirmative on either the framework, rule of the ballot question, as well as like your theory of power. And again, this allows you to get super, super creative and the type of critical affs that you want to run. Now, the negatives is T-framework cap plus the case debate can be a hefty burden to beat if you are not well read on them and don't have it all prepped out, and don't know how to impact weigh versus, like, say, T-framework, or deal with a framework debate plus the cap turns, right? The biggest ones is if your affirmative is one that is on the wiki already and you're in an elim round, or someone has just prepped you out, they can run a billion picks on you, and that just means that you're basically running a traditional policy affirmative at that point in terms of like what you have to cover, because dealing with 6 offs as a critical affirmative is just not fun. Another con can also be seen as a pro is the emotional investment most debaters put into critical affirmatives, because they're generally from like your own writing, instead of just randomly picking authors for your policy app. This means that sometimes you get very, very emotionally invested, and because you're debating it, someone has to argue with you, and sometimes it can get really, really draining to have to debate these sorts of things. If you're running a critical affirmative, you need to have an understanding of high theory and the critiques associated with high theory. This goes with the last point about having a general good knowledge base against other critiques, because if you're depending on ideology that is not from the status quo and instead is critiquing the status quo, you have to have an idea of how have other individuals critiqued your idea of trying to challenge the status quo from a critical perspective. Generally there is, and so you want to be ready for that debate. And lastly, the soft left affirmative, which is what we ran most of last year. The cool thing about a soft left affirmative is generally you only really need one contention plus framework, and there are multiple framing issues associated with soft left affs. They can be from impact weighing, i.e. the framework debate proper, the rule of the ballot argumentation, as well as like critical offense versus negative positions. It's also very solvency heavy because you want to leverage as much of your affirmative to say that counter plans can't solve it, and to engage the critique on the alternative level concerning your solvency. So this is one of those, like, it gets really, really heavy on the contention and the solvency, and permutations allow you for a lot of really creative ones versus counterplans and critiques, because you don't generally defend all state action or the type of state actions that big stick Fs do. So you can get some really fun permutations and link turns out of it. And another thing about soft-left Fs is if you're not a fan of like big stick impacts and the politics associated with it, you don't have to, right? You can do something that you enjoy and like without having to be emotionally invested in being okay to say, if this happens, X amount of people will die and it's really, really horrible, that are very similar to what becomes like, what happened with invasions abroad with America, right? Now, the cons associated with it is that if you link into a disad, and if you don't win your framework, you're probably going to lose, because disads, generally speaking, versus soft-left Fs also culminate in extinction. So you need to utilize a lot of framing arguments versus the disad as offense, as well as getting turns and a lot of defense on the disads, where some policy affirmatives that use big sticks may not need to. You generally also link into a lot of the weird, wacky counterplans that policy affirmatives do, especially in the elim level, so having to prepare for all that can be not as fun. And as I said before, picks are generally not your friend, because if you don't have defense of the entirety of your affirmative, they can just pick out of something, and you will also have to defend your affirmative versus that, so you need to be prepared for it. And finally, impact calculus, impact framing, and roll of the ballot arguments are the things that soft-left Fs utilize a lot versus negative positions, and if you don't know how to utilize it correctly, you're going to lose, because just an extinction outweighs will almost and always beat you. Well, that's it for the type of affirmatives for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any comments, go ahead and write it down, and I will see you at another date. Thank you.